Thank you for joining me. I want to talk a little bit today about a second aspect of the pornography topic that is important, that goes beyond feminist criticisms to another camp that opposes pornographic consumption. For starters, recall that the standard liberal justification of pornography is that pornographic dispersion and consumption is morally justifiable on autonomy grounds. If something is within the realm of personal decision making, then it ought to stay in that realm, and it ought not to be something that society ought to prohibit or restrict by virtue of the harm that it does to society. If the great good of being in the realm of the realm of personal decision making, is such that it ought to outweigh other kinds of considerations. And certainly, on the topic of pornography consumption, the standard liberal position is that the autonomy and freedom that is gained by virtue of allowing pornographic consumption is so great that it ought to outweigh all other considerations. Okay, feminists object against this on grounds of harm to women. There are also classical moralists, and I happen to be a classical moralist. I consider pornography to be immoral. I consider pornography dispersion and consumption to be immoral. And I actually favor prohibitions on pornography. I don't think that free speech rights in the American Constitution or in the Western moral tradition generally protect obscenity, and I actually oppose pornographic legalization on those grounds. However, let's think about the philosophical argumentation apart from the actual legal status. So, the philosophical arguments that classical moralists raise against pornography is that pornography dispersion and consumption is immoral because of the damage that it does to the personal characters of the persons who consume it, and also because of the damage that it does more generally to the society apart from those personal characters. So for starters, how does pornography damage the personal characters of the persons who consume it? Well, it harms their views of sexuality. It treats sexuality often as something that's just physical bodies and not romantic attachment. It treats sexuality as something that's reducible just to short, non-emotionally engaged physical exchanges, often exchanges that are characterized by violence or by some other sort of harassment style involvement. And as such, it is degrading to the characters of the persons who consume it because it undermines what ought to be the view of human sexuality that humans ought to take, namely that sexuality is a beautiful thing, the sort of a thing that you should engage in the context of committed romantic relationships. And instead, it depicts sexuality as a kind of it reduces it to kind of a physical exchange that often is separated from comprehensive or holistic engagements with other human beings. It depicts it as um, a sort of a physical act only. Okay, and this is harmful on classical morality to the individual who consumes the pornography. And certainly as sociological evidence of the harm, classical moralists would point to contemporary trends like trends in male inability to engage with women because of pornographic consumption, and to be able to maintain romantic relationships with women, and actually to perform sexual acts because of the extent of the pornographic consumption, which has damaged their brains and their ability to interact in a sexually meaningful way with real women. Okay, also though, apart from the harm that is done to the individual on classical morality, there is another line of criticism that can be launched against pornography, and that is that pornography is harmful to society. It is harmful to a variety of others who are not themselves consenting to the consumption of pornography, but who have to face the repercussions and the impact of the damaged behaviors of those persons who have consumed pornography. So what do I mean here? Well, I mean things like the spouse of the person who is a pornography consumer, or the girlfriend or boyfriend of the pornography consumer, the children of the pornography consumer. If you look at the sociological statistics, the reasons for divorce, at least in the United States, show that a very high percentage of divorces are traceable in part to pornography addictions. It's quite surprising, actually, how many such divorces seem to stem from the relational detachment that results from pornographic consumption. But apart from divorce, there is also the inability to form romantic attachments in the first place, which is seen by classical moralists as a harm to the general society because it harms all those people who otherwise would have been able to form romantic attachments with the person who can't do that because of his pornography consumption. Uh, such persons cannot ever, depending on the situation, be involved in romantic committed relationships because the pornography consumer has been so deeply damaged by his pornography consumption that he can't meet them in such relationships. Okay, who else does it harm? Well, it harms everyone who's not directly involved in the production and consumption of pornography. Maybe it helps those who are financially benefited from the production of pornography, but pretty much everybody else on the classical moralist view is damaged by virtue of the degraded personal relationships that occur or the absence of personal relationships that result. Okay, the standard liberal response to the classical morality objections is that the great good of personal autonomy in the realm of sexuality uh, justifies pornographic consumption, and it overrides or trumps all other considerations, including any damage that is done to society. And the classical moralist response to that standard liberal response is that if you look at the actual sociological statistics, the incredible damage that is done by pornography to the society renders it sufficiently harmful and unjustifiable that it ought to be regulated. Certainly, child pornography ought to be regulated, but even for some, such as myself, adult pornography too ought to be regulated or prohibited. Okay, so that's the standard liberal position and also the classical moralist response to the standard liberal position. At the end of the day, I am convinced by the classical moralist response, as I mentioned, and it's because having been a professor for a number of years, having seen my students harmed by pornography consumption, having also just witnessed in the general society as a citizen of the United States in the 21st century the number of people whose lives get damaged by this stuff, I think that it's pretty clear that no amount of personal freedom gains that are achieved by virtue of having legal pornography can be justified in the face of the extraordinary harm that is done to the consumers of pornography and also to the many other people, innocents in society, who end up being abused or on the receiving end of other kinds of horrible sexual acts, rape and sexual assaults, child abuse, things like that. Um, I think that the sociological evidence is overwhelming on this score. So I do think that actually the position that morality and obscenity that obscenity is not protected under First Amendment free speech rights, and that right morality ought to prohibit pornography dispersion and consumption is the correct position on this particular topic.